All right, so let me get going here. So this is myself, my pre-COVID self, I joke, looking a bit more optimistic. My name is Talia Charney, and I'm the Nutrition and Health Education Manager for Now Foods Canada, who is also sponsoring this webinar. I have a long, I guess 4 decades or more now, I'm losing track, history in the wellness industry. I've been a personal trainer and a fitness instructor. I'm a holistic nutrition and wellness coach. And I have a background in all kinds of things, from food and vegetarian cooking and meditation and essential oils. And I've done quite a few talks for Healthy Planet, and all of them you can find on their YouTube channel again. I always just show here my training values because they're important. And obviously I have an avid hobby writing books. All right. Disclaimer, I always have to say, I'm just going to lower this camera again. Of course, these presentations, webinars are for informational purposes only. They don't constitute the practice of medicine. So any information you see here, written or stated, materials linked, or questions answered at the end, of course, that's at the user's own risk. If you want to know for any products I mentioned, which won't come till till towards the end, please visit nowfoods.ca, although I'll go through some of them. You can see suggested uses, doses. If you're wondering, like, can I use this with medication I'm on and such, the cautions for the products can be found on the website as well. And having said that, of course, my talk goes outside of what you see on the bottle, because why would you want to come here and have me just repeat what you can already see on them? So I talk out of the box and off the labels because I want to provide information, and you can take that information with you to a trusted healthcare provider, a nutritionist, naturopath, maybe a great medical doctor, and see if these may be helpful to you. And hopefully you will find some of these ideas helpful. As I said, we're co-sponsored tonight by Now Health Group. So Now is just a bit older than me, 56-year-old family-owned company. Wonderful company. If you're curious to know the whole history, and it's a very interesting one, I promise you can actually go on their website and download this ebook. But the founder was Elwood Richard here. He's a scientist, and the products in Canada are manufactured in Guelph, Ontario, and Now is most well known for its quality testing, doing an average of 19,000 quality tests a month in its 8 state-of-the-art labs. Now, I'm not going to tell you much about the slide right now, but for now, what I want you to do is stand about arm's length away from whatever device you right now are using, and try not to blink too much and just stare at this dot. I'm going to tell you a little bit later on, I'm going to keep your curiosity going, why I'm having you do this and what effect it may be having on you. Hint, there's something to do with tonight's topic. Very hot tea. Okay, so we'll get back to that. Now, anything going on in your mind or brain by the way of your state, whether you're focused or motivated, all of this is a part of the talk or chatter that's going on in your brain. And the language that your brain uses is twofold. One is it uses electricity. So you have these cells called neurons. Here's one and here's the other. And that electricity flows from one to the other to the other. But the second thing, these look like they're connected, but there's actually a space. And in those gaps, the second language is the language of chemicals. These little chemicals come along in like a taxi or an Uber, and they're released into that space. Depending on how many are released, how well they swim across to these receiving areas on the other end and bind, that's also going to affect the signal. So that's the language in the brain, is electricity and chemicals. I'm going to be talking about 2 chemicals in particular here, better named as neuromodulators, if you want to know, dopamine and norepinephrine. because understanding some of the science in the background is not only interesting, but will really help you understand what these products ultimately that you can take may do. So dopamine and norepinephrine, and I'll repeat these again and again. So what we want to do if we want to affect our focus or our motivation is we want to change the conversation in our head. And there are ways that we can affect those chemicals. For example, with dopamine, we can affect dopamine levels theoretically by providing the building blocks of how we make dopamine, which come through our diet. Sleep can affect many of the chemicals in our body, positively or negatively. Stimulus, so all of your senses, what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, all of that can affect those chemicals in your brain, sends a signal of electricity and then chemicals. Our behaviors, which I'm going to mention some interesting ones later, including staring at that dot. Our genetics certainly will determine where some of those chemicals are, kind of baseline. And supplements or even prescription drugs can affect them as well. So here's the brain, and these chemicals, in this case dopamine, they're released from a certain area, and then certain circuits in the brain light up. So dopamine and norepinephrine, what do? I'm going to talk about this metaphorically. Dr. Andrew Huberman, if you've heard of him, you'll see a lot of references to him on my various slides, so I should thank him for he has provided a lot of information. He's talked a lot about dopamine and focus. Dopamine is kind of like a conductor, and it's telling certain parts of the brain to kind of light up where you're focusing on a task, and other parts of the brain to be more quiet. So it will be saying like this part of the orchestra should be louder now and playing, and the other part should be quiet or maybe silent. If the brain is working well, then we can focus. We can say in ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, that there's an issue here that sometimes the part of the orchestra that's supposed to be quiet is making too much noise, making it difficult to we're not having a nice, beautiful symphony. We've got Chopin playing and then some Tchaikovsky coming in at the same time, and it's confusing and we're scattered. Then we have norepinephrine. This is the other prominent chemical also involved in focus. It acts like it helps to boost the signal in those areas that are strongest, that your brain is using to focus. It helps adjust the volume and the frequency of those signals to make them stronger, and together these two can help with your focus and other things that are very interesting. Now, in modern times, no surprise, we have a way of sabotaging how focus works. So one really interesting fact is that when these networks are lit up, they are specific to the task we're focusing on right now. But if you are distracted and you switch tasks, for example, your phone just beeps and you look to quickly read a message, we think that we can just go back to the first task, but it actually takes 15 minutes to switch tasks. And by 15 minutes, I mean 15 minutes for our brain to properly get back, for that orchestra to reorganize and start playing as it was. You may not notice that, but that's the case. So imagine the chaos with the constant interruptions we get. So here's a quote from Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast. So many people who think they have attention deficit issues have probably just put themselves in compromised environments, which include smartphone apps and other things for sure. There's absolutely no way that they ought to be able to focus. In fact, perhaps the fact that they can focus at all is miraculous given the constraints. It is like trying to run with shackles on. So even though this webinar is not about, turn off your cell phones and that sort of stuff, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least say these things. I'm terrible at this. Sometimes, because the temptations are great, I have to actually delete apps, make it that much harder to, engage with them, or turn off the phone So right now I have everything turned off on my phone, hopefully. Turn notifications off. On many apps, you can do that because every time you get a beep, you know, we are distracted and so on. So those things are kind of foundational. I don't think there's anything you can take or do if you don't get these things to a degree under control to help yourself. Now, getting a little bit more sciencey, here's dopamine and norepinephrine that I already mentioned. They are part of these three chemicals in the brain. You don't have to worry so much about this one, but they are as a group called catecholamines. That's why I got the little cats here, just to remind us when I say catecholamines. And they're both involved in focus. So you have dopamine, that's focus, but they have big personalities. It's not just focus. Dopamine is important for motivation and pleasure. Norepinephrine for arousal, alertness, and attention. I'll get more into those. There's certain vitamins and things that other hormones that we need in the body in order for these to be made and to convert from one to the other. So you have to be generally healthy. And these two, L-phenylalanine and tyrosine, are basically just pieces of what makes up proteins. They're called amino acids. Get them from our diet. You can also get these in supplements. And when I get to the end to the supplement called True Focus Concentration, these two are in that product. And so presumably and in theory, they can help raise levels of these other chemicals in the brain, thus changing or adjusting the conversation temporarily. So let's go on a bit more. Dopamine, the best way to think about it is as it's a very future focused chemical. It's taking us into what is to come. So it helps us focus, but it's about pursuit, what's out there, anticipation of a reward, curiosity. Many people have associated in the past with pleasure. So you eat an ice cream and your dopamine levels go up from the pleasure, but it's even the pursuit of the ice cream that can more so boost the dopamine than even the reward itself. Motivation is a key part of it. In order to pursue, you need to be motivated and anticipate something good. So that's dopamine. This experiment, it was an incredible example of how powerful dopamine is for motivation. These rats they had their dopamine essentially dropped to 0. When they pushed a lever and had food pellets drop right in front of them, they were still able to eat them and experience pleasure, and they enjoyed them. But with no dopamine, when the pellets were dropped just one body length in front of them, they didn't go to get them. They didn't have the motivation to secure this yummy pellet. So that's how profoundly dopamine can affect our motivation. Then we have norepinephrine again. As I mentioned before with the orchestra, it's a signal booster. It's involved, as you can see with this gentleman, in focus, arousal, attention, alertness. All of these things are actually part of our stress response. So the stress response, you think, oh, well, that's a bad thing. I don't want to be stressed. But in the background, we always have a certain level of dopamine and norepinephrine. We don't want to have 0 stress hormones. There's always an optimal amount. We need a certain amount of stress in order to be ready and to be engaged in whatever we are doing. If we had none of that, then we would be the opposite, which would be completely lethargic and unable to do anything. And if you look at prescription medications for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I'll just call it ADHD going forward. Some come under this general category of amphetamines, including basically speed. That's a recreational drug, of course, but Adderall is a common one. Methylphenidate, Ritalin has a long history of use for children. But all of these, what they have in common is they target our catecholamines, our dopamine and norepinephrine. And what they end up doing is these drugs, as it says down here, they reduce noise. So in that part of the orchestra that we need to keep quiet so we can focus on the other part of the orchestra. They amplify the desired signals in the brain. So that's like the norepinephrine, turning up the volume in attention-related brain networks. And by doing so, they enhance focus on mundane tasks, give a sense of confidence, and a sense of well-being. In excess, maybe euphoria, but so these catecholamines not only affect focus and motivation, but also our sense of well-being. If you think about it, if you have no motivation, if you have no impetus to pursue, if you have zero arousal, you are lethargic, and you are going to feel unwell emotionally as well. Because of that, you'll see now these are different types of drugs that have been used, some going sort of older ones, tricyclic antidepressants, and some newer ones like SSRIs. Many of the drugs used for depression not only target serotonin, which is often referred to as our happy hormone, but many of them, you can see here, also target those catecholamines. In fact, some of the newer generation, like Wellbutrin, only target the catecholamines, meaning it is recognized that those are also important for our mood. Time for a sip of tea. A really interesting documentary on Netflix called Take Your Pills talked a lot about how there's abuse of these drugs, Adderall in particular, on college campuses in the US. I don't know about here in Canada, but I would assume that's going on to some extent. And Dr. Andrew Huberman discussed specifically that there are some increased risks with these above and beyond what you'd normally expect for people who have attention deficit disorder, for those who are using them who don't have that diagnosis, such as a higher risk of future addiction, whereas it's shown that we believe that for those who do have attention deficit and take them, they actually have a lower risk of addiction. Higher risk of euphoria sounds like a good thing, but not when it's in excess or that it increases a risk of psychotic episodes such as schizophrenia. And the long-term use, especially in this population, is poorly studied, or I'd say not studied at all. We don't know because these are not people who would be studied. They don't have that diagnosis. Dopamine also has a role when it comes to procrastination. So there are two types of procrastinators. One are those people who like to use or leverage their stress, their adrenaline, to get things done. So they just thrive doing things at the last minute. But there's other people that may procrastinate because they have low dopamine levels or poorly functioning dopamine. They lack the motivation, they lack the focus to get things done. This I found fascinating of all the things I looked into. This is a blink you're looking at, blinking. And so one of the ways we can actually measure indirectly our dopamine levels, or to get a sense of, is by how frequently we blink. So dopamine affects how frequently we blink. Those who have high dopamine levels blink less. Remember at the beginning I told you, try not to blink when you're focusing? Blinking rate also may affect your dopamine levels, but so dopamine and blinking levels are related, and based on how much you blink, it's kind of like having a curtain when you're watching a show close and open. And it doesn't actually affect time, but it affects our perception of time. So when you have high dopamine levels and you blink less, you tend to overestimate time, and because of that, you tend to be someone who might arrive early or maybe be on time and are more focused. Whereas if you have low dopamine levels, you blink more and you tend to underestimate time, and these are people who tend to be late. So that's how also your sense of time and when you show up can also be affected by your dopamine levels. If you've ever been in a state where, 2 hours go by and you think, oh my God, you got so much done. You weren't distracted, you were in the zone. This is often referred to as flow state. And this state is thought to be characterized by a cascade of chemistry going on in the brain, which includes the norepinephrine and dopamine sort of being in those optimal levels. So you're seeing the theme here that dopamine and norepinephrine can affect many things, even our creativity in part, or what we call divergent, our ability to have divergent thinking, openness, creativity, when we're in a state of daydreaming or mind wandering, is also affected by dopamine. It's just thought to be affected in a sort of upside down U, where there's a middle way best amount of dopamine, kind of like the Goldilocks principle. Too little dopamine, and our creativity is stunted a bit. The right amount, we have it. And then if it goes too high, again, we have less divergent thinking. So there's an optimal amount. Now, this is very interesting. You've heard of the expression, the eyes are the window to the soul, but actually the eyes are just an extension of our brains, actually part of our brain. So we evolved the ability to see, first and foremost, actually not so we could actually navigate around the world, but as a way to provide signals to the brain from the outside world. And so this is an interesting little tidbit or tip. We can impact our level of alertness, meaning our dopamine and norepinephrine levels, by simply adjusting the direction of our eyes. If you look up for 15 seconds, this triggers alertness chemicals in your brain. So this is a cost-free way to help with your alertness. Now going back to that first slide, here is that black dot you might recall that I had you all stare at. So here's the study, having people look at a sort of dot out in the, in front of them. If you focus your attention on one space beyond your peripersonal space, so that's beyond where you can reach, for 30 to 60 seconds, this helps prime the body for goal pursuit, puts you in a state of readiness. Time for the tea again. So here are some ways to support dopamine. Some interesting tips. If you have a cold shower or an ice bath, I suppose, for 1 to 3 minutes, this can boost your dopamine levels. This is not me. I'm not into this, but if you are, that's a good tip. Eating foods that provide that protein building block, tyrosine, that are high in tyrosine may be helpful. Nuts, fermented cheeses, and beef are particularly high, but there's others. You can Google that. Of course, I think we all know that caffeine can help with our focus, so this should come as no surprise. Maybe a certain dose, and it depends on the person and your sensitivity and how adapted you are to it. Actually, if you don't drink coffee every day and you have it occasionally, it works better than if you have it every day. And then, this is really important, exposing our eyes to the appropriate light and darkness according to our natural circadian rhythm. Now, I did a whole talk not too long ago. It's on the YouTube channel on circadian rhythm, which is really interesting and tells us how to use, how to time things for optimal health. But getting out and exposing your eyes to sunlight before 10 a.m. is really important. And then having complete darkness at nighttime. And I wear a mask because it's hard to make my room pitch dark, and that's the case for many people. Now, there's not a lot of studies when it comes to particular diet and focus, but there are some studies on what's called the oligoantigenic diet and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children. There was a study, this one particular one, it's not the only one. And what they did was have these kids eliminate certain foods, which we call the allergenic foods, foods that are more commonly associated with allergies, like eggs and corn, citrus, legumes, and of course wheat or gluten, and eat other foods. It wasn't perfect, the outcome. 40% of kids improved, but there was some. The study has been criticized as well as others, but I think that any naturopath or nutritionist, if you go to them with, especially with a kid with attention deficit disorder, they're definitely going to be highly likely to be doing some kind of elimination diet. And I certainly, there's a lot of anecdata showing that that can be helpful, but it's going to vary what helps and who it helps. Now, if you want to keep your dopamine levels sustained without crashing, one of the best ways is to have intermittent rewards. So that means that the rewards that are coming to you need to be unpredictable to you. Slot machines are a perfect example. The winning is unpredictable. You don't know, when you're going to win, and so the dopamine keeps going up. You're highly motivated. If you won every time you pulled the slot machine, it wouldn't affect your dopamine levels the same way. So one way you can take advantage of this is to somehow not celebrate all of your wins, or to give the control of awards over to someone else. Or if you have, like have a child or somebody that you're trying to affect their dopamine levels, you can reward them, but don't reward them every time. Make it a little unpredictable. Example for me would be, now this is more of where it can get into the addictions, is if I post something on my social media, every time I post it, I don't know if people will like it. I don't know if it's going to go viral. There's that unpredictability. So that makes me keep checking and keeps checking, because my dopamine is being boosted by the unpredictable nature of the reward. Dopamine also can affect our working memory, as can norepinephrine. Now, when you're doing a focused task, working memory is holding things in your head just for a very short while, seconds to, maybe a minute or two, so you can complete that task, such as you see with this lady, maybe doing something mathematical in your head, or someone gives you a phone number and you have to hold it in your head till you write it down. That's working memory. All right, so here you can see is the True Focus product. I'm going to mention a few other products, but this one in particular I wanted to show tonight. It's called True Focus Concentration because it happens to contain tyrosine and phenylalanine, which when I showed you that pathway in the brain that I called the catecholamines, it was tyrosine and L-phenylalanine that were those building blocks that then convert in the brain to making our dopamine and our norepinephrine. So in theory, taking these is going to help to raise those levels. Now, this is a comprehensive formula, so I'll give you a little bit of information about some of the other ingredients. Taurine is another amino acid, a type of a part of protein, and it is thought to help raise another chemical in our brain called GABA, which has a bit of a sort of a calming effect on the brain. You think about it, there has to be a certain amount of calm to focus. Grapeseed extract in there is an antioxidant. DMAE is it's a compound that actually was once prescribed for attention deficit disorder, and it was prescribed because it was shown to raise another chemical in the brain also associated with focus. So there's not just dopamine and norepinephrine, but something else just out of interest if you want to know. It's called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is also important for focus. In fact, it's for when it comes to dementia, the drugs that unfortunately are not too effective, but the drugs that have been developed for that are targeting acetylcholine, trying to increase the levels of acetylcholine. Ginkgo biloba, this is a herb that has been around for many years. It's a leaf extract, and ginkgo is known to increase blood flow generally in the body, including to the brain. Vitamin B6 was one of the vitamins in that pathway I showed you. You probably didn't notice it because I didn't really point out all the vitamins, but it is needed as well to convert one thing to the other. So it can help if you have low levels to sustain dopamine. And lastly, a little bit of, these are all supportive ingredients, a little bit of coenzyme Q10. That's something in every cell in your body that helps you produce energy in all of your cells, and the brain is actually extremely energy intensive. It uses up a lot of energy. So that is a description of this comprehensive formula, True Focus. And you can see that it says 1 to 2 capsules, 1 to 2 times a day. General recommendation for anything if you're trying or starting it, because everyone's different, everyone's response is different, everyone's sensitivity is different, is to just start with a very low dose, such as just 1 capsule. Now, often before I'm doing these webinars, I will take 2 capsules of True Focus 30 minutes before I start. So 30 minutes before mental or physical activity where you need to focus. And that sort of works for me. One bit of advice is for some people, taking it in the later afternoon towards the evening may affect sleep. Not always, it doesn't for me, but it could, because if you think about the more alert and aroused you are, the less prone you are to want to go to sleep. So that timing is something to keep in mind. If you look at the claim on the bottle, it doesn't say anything that's going to really help you understand any of the ingredients. So that's why I'm doing this webinar. Need a sip before this one here. So there's a lot of information on risk on the bottle. Not because it's necessarily highly risky, but if you read through it and distill it, this won't apply to most people. So I like to go through this now. All of the information on the bottle, except for a small bit, are just details about what you need to take to your doctor to get approval. So these are not contraindications. They're not saying you cannot use this product under these circumstances, but that you should do it under the advisement of a professional. The do not use is for pregnancy and breastfeeding. That's typically on most supplements, and for people who are on blood thinners, because ginkgo biloba in this product can also thin the blood. You don't want to combine the two. But for the others, so I mentioned DMAE raises this chemical in the brain, acetylcholine, which can be helpful for focus and for the brain in general. But there are certain people with conditions who are put on drugs that intentionally try to reduce or block this acetylcholine, or to reduce it in the brain. For example, people who have COPD, bladder conditions, Parkinson's. Not everybody. So if you are on these type of drugs to help manage or epilepsy or Parkinson's, then you'd have to talk to your doctor before using a product such as this. So that's what the bulk of these are for. Neurological diseases, because we're affecting the brain and chemicals in the brain, so we need to be a bit more cautious. If someone has a pre-existing kidney disease, they would know they always need to be cautious about their protein intake, because they can't get rid of them like other people can. And because this product, the first 2 ingredients are types of proteins, or the building blocks for proteins, that's why this is there. In terms of people who are on medications for diabetes or high blood pressure, I don't think the risk is very high. Nevertheless, it has to be stated. Grapeseed extract in this product is an antioxidant that has been shown in some clinical trials to have small effects on lowering blood sugar and lowering blood pressure. So if you're taking medications that are doing the same, just got to be careful it's not too much of a good thing, as they say. So that describes all of those details, hopefully. As I said, this is all on nowfoods.ca, those details. Now you can also just consider a product like this, tyrosine, which is just that one ingredient, the first ingredient that was in the True Focus. It's just simple one ingredient. And it actually has its own set of risk factors that I won't read out or go over in detail. But this one says on the bottle, it's more specific actually to focus. It says helps to decrease cognitive fatigue due to physically stressful situations. So examples it actually gives on the bottle are based on studies that were done. of what's a stressful situation. So people had extended wakefulness or exposure to cold or excessive noise. These are all stressors, and taking tyrosine uh, helped enhance their cognitive function in the face of these stressors. So here's a little bit of a more of an explanation of how that happens. So here's that pathway again. And norepinephrine, remember I mentioned this is actually a part of our stress response because we need that arousal and attention and focus. So in under circumstances of more or more stress, norepinephrine is depleted because it's being used. Um, and it is there to help provide a protective effect during stress by giving us enough arousal, attention, and alertness to handle it. So by taking tyrosine, what it does is it drives this pathway to keep those norepinephrine levels up. So this is a sort of a safety buffer to prolong its effects. And that's how it works. And it would work the same in the product True Focus, but it doesn't have that detail on the bottle. I want to say that, of course, whenever we're thinking about any of these chemicals, and I've said it before, it's all about a balance there, and that balance is going to be different for everybody. So we need dopamine. It's great. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. So some advice here, this is from Dr. Andrew Huberman again. Don't stack too many dopamine sources at once. So you don't want to take energy drinks and coffee and True Focus all at the same time. Some stacking can occur and maybe will be helpful. It's really something that you need to experiment with along with someone who will help advise you. If you experience a crash afterwards, that's generally an indication that you've gone out of balance too much. And long term, stacking too many things, taking too many, sort of stimulants, things that stimulate you, this can undermine our long-term motivation and continued drive. And it does this, well, the best example really are people who are addicted to very strong drugs, that, cocaine or other things that are really sending dopamine levels up so high. What happens is when they crash, then their baseline dopamine levels that are kind of always there, that's that background noise, drop. And they drop lower than they were previously. And that craving and irritability that an addict will feel is they're wanting to bring those dopamine levels just up to normal levels. Because as I said, these affect our sense of well-being as well. And so, if dopamine is very low or too low, we might feel apathetic, have issues with attention, be procrastinating, generally feel lethargic, have poor focus. But if they're too high, then we may feel euphoric, manic, in some cases, psychosis or even panic attacks. So it's all about that middle of the range. And when, anyone who's on a prescription drug, even for, say, ADHD, hopefully that dose is always being adjusted as well. Your doctor never knows how you're going to respond to a drug, and those need to be adjusted as well. And different doses work for different people. I want to show you a couple of other options that are not necessarily to do with tonight's topic too directly, but just to provide some more examples of things that, for example, can help with ADHD. Because there are actual clinical trials on this product, phosphatidylserine, I wanted to mention that, even though this is only for adults, approved by Health Canada for adults, so it would have to be run by a medical doctor, if you have a kid who's already on a prescription medication, or who's not. But it's relatively simple in the sense there's no cautions on this bottle except for do not use during pregnancy and breastfeeding for adults. So it's simpler to use. If you've got a lot of existing conditions, then anyone can use this. That's a little bit of detail about the study. 200 milligrams were used for 2 months and reduced both hyperactivity and attention deficit. But again, this doesn't have to be for ADHD. It can just be to help with focus in general. And omega-3s, of course. So I'm sure you've heard of omega-3s and may know their importance to the brain. There is a lot of omega-3 in the brain, in our around our cells in the brain. We have the cell walls, and there you will find a concentration of, in particular, DHA, which is a type of omega-3. If you look on any omega-3 bottle, if you look at the Now Kids omega-3, you will see DHA and EPA there. So that can be helpful as well. And there's studies showing that these two combined work better together, or that this phosphatidylserine works better with an omega-3. Phosphatidylserine is also something naturally produced in the body, and we find most of it also in the brain and also in the cell and the area surrounding our cells, that cell wall. And one last product I want to mention, because it has really good clinical trials showing notable effects. So I'm quite a fan of it. It's called rhodiola. This is what it looks like. It's a woody plant. It's used in herbal medicine to help with temporary symptoms of stress, such as mental fatigue and sensation of weakness, and to support cognitive functions such as mental focus and mental stamina. So it says that right on the bottle. It's telling you that it is for mental stamina in the face of stress. So this would be for someone who is finding it hard to focus and to sustain their focus when they are under stress. And here are some of the details. Again, for these, you can find the risks and contraindications on our website, or just go back and watch this video on the YouTube channel. And lastly here, I just want to show you a quick study on rhodiola. Now, this was done in doctors who have to work night shift. And there was a quite objective measurement of how they responded. It's called the fatigue index. And the subjective measure showed that after 2 weeks of continuous daily use of rhodiola, the improvement was approximately 20%. So they were able to focus in the face of fatigue 20% better than before they started using it. And that is the end of tonight's webinar. So thank you so much for anybody who went from the beginning to the end. And now I'm going to take some questions.